This is the Bartholomew Town Podcast.
Hi, everyone. Welcome into another edition of the Bartholomew Town Podcast. I'm your host, Bill Bartholomew. On today's episode, we talk all things outer space with science journalist Bob Zimmerman, the person behind the website Behind the Black. And greetings from our Providence, Rhode Island studios. A pleasure to have you on board, as always, here on the Bartholomew Town Podcast, approaching episode 250. Can you believe it? Wow. And of course, also approaching Election Day. Now, I want to let you know that next week, we're going to have daily pods here on B-Town. We're going to look at a ballot question. We're going to talk to some candidates. We're going to have some commentary on the presidential election. Everything from the most nuanced corner of Rhode Island all the way out, of course, to the global picture with COVID-19 and the presidential election. It's all coming your way on B-Town, which is a listener-supported program. And for as little as $3 per month, you may help to sustain the independent journalism, opinion, analysis, and entertainment that we've become known for. Simply head over to patreon.com/BartholomewTown or click the support link wherever you're listening right now. And be sure to give me a follow on Twitter and Instagram at Bill Bartholomew. We're going to have all sorts of stuff heading into the election on Election Day itself. And of course, look, this isn't going to be decided. We know for sure this isn't going to, most likely anyway, I'll say that. We're not going to have a result on Election Day proper. So there's going to be a lot of conversation going on, obviously Election Day night and in the days following, and let's hope not too far thereafter. But the social media pages, that'll be really where we can get into the thick of some of the nuances, and it's always fun to interact with you there. You can send me an email anytime, Bill, B-I-L-L, at ripodcast.com. Okay, now this is a fun episode here. Mr. Bob Zimmerman, you may be familiar with his work on his space website, Behind the Black, or as a guest on Coast to Coast Talk Radio, and fairly timely because I think a lot of the conversation that we have today, we're at this really interesting point in terms of space exploration, technology, so on and so forth, the intersection of the private sector and the public sector, and really how they're working together, or in some cases not working together. And look, I think that this impacts, for some people, if you are examining the presidential election and policy at large, space is something that's obviously not on the forefront of the conversation in 2020 for most people, but it's still there, you know, and it's certainly something that could factor into the result of the presidential election and some of the senatorial and congressional races happening around the country. So without further ado, let's get right to it. Bob Zimmerman, Behind the Black.
As a journalist, I take a very old-fashioned point of view. I focus on facts when I write, and I don't speculate a lot. I like to at least separate the two if I can. So let's talk about space, science, that kind of stuff.
That's an interesting thing now where we have this sort of convergence of opinion, journalism, entertainment, and it's obviously it's a tired conversation at this point, trying to break the two apart, but you wonder, do you really feel that there's been a seismic shift in that the role that journalists play right now in terms of where you it's hard for, I don't want to say up and coming or new, but really anyone by and large you're challenged by trying to meet all those demands but also stick to the facts. Is that something you've noticed, a trend?
There is a philosophical loss, Western civilization concepts that has been lost in younger generation and with most journalists today. It's not that you should be objective. It's impossible to be objective, but you need to recognize when you're dealing with a story of any kind, whether I'm writing a history about space exploration, or I'm writing about COVID-19, or I'm writing about images from Mars, you've got to be very aware of what is hard data, real facts, real information, and what is models and theorizations and hypotheses. You have to distinguish between the two so you can figure out where the uncertainties are and the unknowns are, and so then you can report on what's real and what isn't. And I'm very clear on both my website and in all my books. I'm very clear about who I am and what I believe in. I'm not hiding anything. So people can also distinguish between one and the other. But anything I write, I'm always trying to find what the facts are, and then state that part of it. And it's an understanding of that distinction that Western civilization and the Enlightenment brought to us, to humanity 500-600 years ago, beginning with Galileo, that is now becoming lost. And that's a real tragedy, and it's a horrible tragedy coming for future generations if they can't make that kind of distinction. I have a theme on Behind the Black, my website, which I call The Uncertainty of Science. I'll report on a lot of stories that some of which get big play in the mainstream media, and I'll report on why this is really not that big a deal, or we shouldn't take it too seriously because there's so many uncertainties involved. And I'll go into those. A good example is life on Venus. They saw evidence of life on Venus a few weeks ago. I'm sure you might have seen it. There were like hundreds of mainstream articles about this, and that was junk. They found a chemical in the atmosphere of Venus in a tiny amount, parts per billion, that on Earth is related to life, life processes. And that doesn't mean on Venus it's formed by life. I mean, that atmosphere is so alien and there's so many gaps in our knowledge about it that to assume that chemical molecule formed because of life, or even to suggest it, is just bad science. It's junk. And most journalists today don't know their own field and don't know these kind of details and don't think it. There's no they're just credulous. They believe any press release they get, and they just repeat the press release journalism. And though I report a lot of press releases, I'm always going to talk about where it's weak and where it's strong and try to give the reader that sense. So that's my distinction. And I think it applies. The real problem I see is that the schools no longer teach it. They don't really teach it. It's not that you be objective. It's just you have to be aware of what the uncertainties are and where your own weaknesses are.
That's a fascinating evaluation of that conversation broadly, because I completely agree with you. It's almost impossible, especially if you are, appearing on any kind of regular basis. It's impossible to hide your inherent biases, but it's a totally different thing to present who you are if it's merged with factual information that is verified versus just as you say, kind of spouting pure opinion and blending that with journalism. So that's a very interesting way of looking at it. Where did you get your start in journalism in general?
I have a wide and unusual history. I came out of college wanting to be a writer. This is back in the 70s. Worked for the federal government as a real estate negotiator for a few years. When I quit, I ended up in the movie business for about 20 years, making really bad movies. I did almost everything you could imagine. These are movies that it is not worth the 90 minutes of your life energy, it's very precious life energy, to watch. That's why I don't tell anybody. This horrible stuff, but it was fun doing. And when I finally, in the mid-90s, got sick of it and said, this is not why I got into the movie business, because I saw films like Grand Hotel and Citizen Kane and said, I want to do something great like that. I have a certain optimistic viewpoint to the world, and I wasn't getting a chance. And so I quit the movie business and started to write science journalism articles for a variety of magazines, and decided I can't make as much money as a freelance writer as I did as a freelance filmmaker without selling books as well, which is all right with me. So I started to push, and I, out of the blue, I decided, the Apollo 8 mission to the moon has been forgotten. This is in the 90s. It was approaching its 30th anniversary, and nobody talked about it. And I said, this needs to be talked about. That was the most important mission of the Apollo program, without question, in terms of history and its impact on the nation. The landing was like an afterthought in terms of its impact on the culture and politics of the United States. But the Apollo 8 mission literally took the country by the shoulders and shook it. So I said, that mission's been forgotten. And I lived through it, so I know that. And so I wrote a history. I wrote a history called Genesis, Story of Apollo 8, telling that story and why that mission, why it had such an impact and what caused it. And, it was the first time ever in history that humans went to another world. It will always be the first time humans ever went to another world. And so that's an important historical matter. So I wrote that book, and so I started to freelance as a journalist from that point on, and spent a lot of years doing magazine articles and writing a number of books all about history of space exploration. And since then, in the last 4 or 5 years, I've switched to a bulk of my writing now is on my webpage, Behind the Black, because for two reasons. One, the pay scales at magazines is going way down. There's too many people who think they can write, and they can get writers for nothing. So I wasn't getting paid as much. It was a lot of work. And secondly, when I could only get maybe 10% of the interesting stories I would see published. Are you there?
I am, and that's a fascinating trend as well. Where you see even established, whether it's writers, broadcasters of any kind, really moving towards the independent journalism model. Because look, you have creative control, and you also have the ability, obviously, and from a monetization standpoint, to control a lot more. The challenge, of course, is that then you're also the editorial director and the custodian, and you've got to do everything that goes from top to
Bill,
bottom.
that brings us back to my first point. If when you're writing, you've got to be an editor, which means you've got to be able to look at your work with a cold eye and fix it. And you can't do that if you can't separate, your weaknesses from your strengths. But the other aspect of writing my own webpage and doing this freelance for myself is not only do I get every story that interests me published instantly within an hour, I also get it published within an hour. I used to be incredibly frustrated. I'd write something and it might be a year before a magazine would finally get it out. And I don't have a problem with editors. Often editors are good. Most of the time they're good. There's a few exceptions, but most of the time editors help my writing. But the time to take and the limits to how much you can publish was very frustrating. And so with the arrival of the internet and the ability to also publish yourself, I can get a lot more done, and it's paying itself back because people read the website and say, "Oh, he's telling us a lot of stuff that no one else is telling us," and I'm very happy to do it, and people are very happy to read it. And I don't have advertisements. I don't. You don't have to pay anything to read the site, but people can donate for free. Donate, and they do, or they subscribe. They don't have to do it, and they do it because they want to support me, and I appreciate it greatly.
Yeah, and I think it builds from my experience here. My background is I began as a musician. I was in New York as a songwriter and musician for a decade before launching anything resembling a journalism career, and I find that the relationship that I have with the audience of this podcast and the other work that I do through this outlet, I suppose, is similar to my relationship as a musician, where the interaction, when you have people who, whether they're contributing financially or they're just reading or just sharing your page, it's different than some of my friends and colleagues who write for some of the major newspapers, where you don't necessarily have that personal relationship with your audience.
Yes, I absolutely agree with that. I mean, I have people can comment on my website, and I respond to a lot of comments because I like the feedback, the give and take, and especially those that are critical. I don't mind that. That helps me clarify my thinking and make sure I'm not making mistakes. Sometimes they correct me, and I appreciate that as well. So yeah, it's been the whole model for being a freelance writer is fundamentally changed in the last, I'd say, decade and a half. And I'd say that in many ways, it's returned to what it used to be in the United States 150, 200 years ago, when you didn't have this very strong, powerful infrastructure of publishing houses and agents and distribution that controlled things. In the very early days, the publishers, they took almost anything. It got published pretty easily. And so there was a real free-for-all to see new writers. And their money went mostly to the writers very quickly. And that changed for many years. And that's now, I think, changing back. And that's a very good thing.
Discover over 200 episodes of Rhode Island's podcast of record, the Bartholomew Town Podcast, on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your pods. Or head over to our website, ripodcast.com. Let's get right into your passion and really what you came onto my radar screen for, which is talking about space and all things space related from a scientific standpoint, from an industrial standpoint. And what a fascinating time right now to be examining outer space, where there's discussion of, and we may be closer than some think or further than some would say, from I guess you would call it space tourism. We've got a somewhat more competitive, if not much more competitive environment with the private sector's involvement in exploring Mars or exploring the outer reaches of our galaxy and beyond. So let's talk about that. And I guess let's start there in the competitive aspect of space tourism and just launching rockets and what we've seen in the last couple of years in terms of unmanned missions, returning to Earth, landing upright, SpaceX, and beyond. Where are we and where are we going? Are we living in the future?
Let me give you a broader look. I've been writing about this for a while, and in fact, one of the conclusions I got out of Genesis was that we, when writing about the Apollo 8 mission, is that we as a nation did that mission to prove that a free people, a competitive free nation with private enterprise can do it better than a top-down, authoritative, command-controlled economy like communism, Soviet Union. That was the reason we did it. But the trouble is that Kennedy employed the Soviet model for going to the moon. He had a government agency up from the top down determine what would be done in space. And even though we won the space race, the one lesson we took out of it, tragically, was the opposite of what was intended. The United States, for the next half century, took as its model, the Soviet model, to go into space. So it was always a government program dictating what would happen next and funded entirely through the government. No freedom within. If you were no freedom allowed. If you were a private company entrepreneur who wanted to do something in space, you had to work with NASA or you didn't go anywhere. They blocked you. And that went on for like 5 decades. And I've always said this. I hate the term a space program. The very term makes me cringe because in a free country, you don't have a program determined and regulated and planned. What you have is chaos. You have competition. You have many people following different dreams within an industry, trying to make money from it, but also doing what they want to do. And it could be any number of choices. There's no program. So that went on for half a century, and it only is in the last decade, little over a decade now, a dozen years, that we are moving away from that Soviet model back to the American model of capitalism and free enterprise and freedom. And it began, it's a long story, but just to summarize it, you started to have competition from companies whose finances came out of the internet, starting with SpaceX is the most famous, but there's a few others. And what they did is they decided, SpaceX in particular, Elon Musk decided to do things. He thought he could make money with a rocket company because he thought the companies that existed were not doing a good job. And he was right. They were not doing a good job. And so there was lots of margin for profit and cutting costs and make a lot of money at the same time. And he proved that with his Falcon 9 rocket. As you mentioned, its first stage returns to Earth, lands vertically, and then is reused. And they reuse them now routinely. And I must tell you that in the 50 years post-Apollo, I can't tell you the number of times I heard managers and engineers in the old space business repeatedly say that it is economically and physically impossible, and that was the word they used, impossible to return that first stage to Earth in any way, and even if you did return it, it wouldn't be usable for another flight. There wouldn't be enough fuel to get your payload into orbit, and then even if you got it, you managed that, you couldn't reuse it. Impossible. They didn't even try. And so SpaceX tried that. And what that did is he suddenly got he stole the market share from the Russians and from a lot of American companies, and he's made billions. And that, of course, has now made investors think, hey, there's money to be made here. And so they're starting to invest in other companies like Rocket Lab and others. There's like 100 different startup rocket companies right now, plus a few that are already successful. And all of them, there's two things that are going on. One, the success of a company like SpaceX and Rocket Lab launching small rockets there, it convinces investors there's money to be made, so the venture capitalists are willing to invest the capital. But there's another point of it, which is that the competition from these companies has lowered the cost to launch by factors, exponential factors, by anywhere 3 to 5 times, even more, so downward. And what that means is you suddenly widen the customer base. There's suddenly a lot of people who would like to do things in space that could make money they can now afford to make money doing it. And so the investors also see there's more money to be made. And so what you got is basically a revolution going on in the space industry. The Trump administration has embraced this. What they're doing now is they're trying to transition from being the boss, telling everyone what to do, to instead just simply be a customer. Buy the product from the private sector. And so private sectors build it, and, on a very superficial level, it seems the same, but it isn't, because when NASA builds it, NASA owns it, and NASA designs it for NASA's purposes, which have nothing to do with making money outside of NASA. But if a company builds something that it sells to NASA, it's going to build it in such a way that it might be a product that could sell to others, which is exactly what SpaceX is doing with its Dragon capsules. Those capsules are going to be used for private commercial manned flights. So you mentioned space tourism, but there's a lot of other possibilities as well with those manned capsules that they can do. And so there's now money to be made outside of the government contracts, because NASA and the government doesn't own it anymore. They're merely a customer buying a product. And that transition is continuing. And the more it happens, it's also devolving power from the government back to the private sector, back to the American people. The government isn't dictating terms of the Soviet model. It has its goals, but it needs to buy the products from the private sector. And that changes the power formula, and it also changes how things work. And so we got competition, and we get a vibrant industry. Then the government has its program, but it's not. That doesn't limit us anymore. That's not the only thing we can do. Now you got other things going on. So you get SpaceX and Elon Musk. He wants to die on Mars. He wants to build his own colony, and so he's building a rocket that can make it possible. And it's going to be cheaper than any rocket ever made, and it's going to be completely reusable, and it will make it possible for anybody to get into space for very little money, relatively. And it's also capable of getting people to Mars. Before it does that, though, it's going to probably revolutionize the transportation industry on Earth, and it's going to also revolutionize the space industry. And he's not the only one. We have Rocket Lab building small rockets. They're also working toward reusability. And those small rockets put up the smaller payloads, the nanosats and the small sats, that have been desperately in need of a launch service that the bigger rocket companies have not been providing. And so Peter Beck, that company's owner, just like Elon Musk, said, there's a market there. I can make money. And he went for it. And he's making money. And he's launching successfully. And he's not going to be the only one. There's more to come.
Undoubtedly. And we also see, of course, the geopolitical implications of this, whether you're talking defense or just in terms of who, on an economic scale, can benefit from a more competitive and a more robust space technology sector, so to speak. So I guess let's talk about, we can talk about Space Force and how this fuels that, although that seems a little bit less on the horizon. Space Force is
an interesting, I'll tell you, Bill, the Space Force is an interesting situation because the reason the Space Force exists is because of a systemic problem that existed within the military and its space effort for the last 20 years. It wasn't so much a problem before then, but the dry rot in Washington, D.C. has made the military space effort a problem because there was no centralized bureaucracy focused on space. The priorities of space were not well handled. And so for the last decade, the bureaucracy, the upper management in the military has been pushing to get Congress to rearrange the Pentagon's bureaucracy to create a separate office for its military space effort so that there can be some focus and it could be prioritized in its own needs. Couldn't get it done. Trump comes along, and Trump knows how to make a deal. And so what he did is he made a big deal about the Space Force, like it was going to be, space cadets with their uniforms and space guns and rocket ships. But But that would only be to make interest. And what it does is it forced them get off the dime, and they got this done. Now, is it going to accomplish the purpose, which is to streamline and focus the bureaucracy on space-related military efforts? I am still unconvinced of that, because of the dry rot in Washington, D.C. The people who are in D.C. for the last 20 years are routinely incompetent and unable to accomplish much, and their focus is not the interest of the nation, but total self-interest and how to line their own pockets. And so that reason, what you might get is a big bureaucracy and not the focused needs of the country in terms of military space. But that's where Space Force comes from. Now, in terms of private space, and the geopolitical aspects of it, Bill, what's really interesting here is that by going back to the American model, we, the United States, are suddenly in a position to completely dominate the exploration of space down the road. One of the reasons we won the space race in the 60s is because even though NASA dictated the terms of the mission, at that time, NASA built almost nothing. It was built by private sector, and we had a very robust, strong private sector that saw potential of a lot of money made in space. That didn't transpire because it got ripped out from under them by the government. But the freedom, the concept of freedom and private enterprise gives us a tremendous advantage. And so for both military and prestige and commercial success, going back to the American model is probably the best thing we can do, and it really puts pressure on everybody else, China, Russia, Europe, to fix their own problems to compete.
What would you say are, as we enter, as we come to the conclusion of what obviously has been certainly the, I guess it's fair to say, the most memorable and in many ways challenging year, at least of my life, that I can think of in terms of rethinking and reimagining how systems are attacked, or whether it's work or just life and joy in general. What's the biggest story space related heading into 2021? Is it a climate sort of indicator or something like sunspots? Is it the exploration of extraterrestrial life? Is it space tourism? Is it geopolitics? Is it something else altogether?
Well, it's a broad question you've asked me, Bill, so it's a little hard to pin it down.
Sure.
But I'll give you some thoughts, all right? 2020, a lot is going to depend on what happens on November 3rd. And so it's hard to predict what the future is going to be depending on what happens then. If I had putting that caveat aside, when it comes to space exploration down the road, I've really just outlined what's the key here. If we allow freedom to blossom and private enterprise to function and these private companies to prosper, then we have an opportunity to do things that we can't even imagine in the next few years. I mean, there is scheduled, it's not proposed, there is scheduled a manned tourism flight for October, 1 year from now, to go to ISS. It is a totally private flight. It's being run by a company called Axiom, who is going to be building modules to attach to ISS that are private modules for their use, commercial use. And Axiom's going to do a tourist mission next year. It's going to have 4 passengers with a professional, their hired astronaut in charge, the pilot. 3 passengers. They have not announced who those passengers are, but it's rumored to be Tom Cruise and his director, having to do with making a movie. And it's almost certainly going to be on a Dragon capsule, because that's really the only unmanned commercial capsule flying right now, which means SpaceX will be the provider to Tom Cruise and Axiom for their transportation. And that's a year from now, only a year from now. And there's no limit to the number of commercial opportunities in manned space once that starts happening. No limit. And so then you can't even imagine the possibilities at that point. Axiom in the next 3 years is going to start building its portion of ISS. Privately designed, privately built, for private use, commercial use for just those kind of flights, designed that when ISS is supposed to be retired, they can detach it and become their own private space station. So that's coming. So that's part of it. The second part of what's coming down the road is, as long as we do not have a gigantic economic collapse, and that's a real unknown here, the exploration of the solar system is going to become even more spectacular in the next few years, because not only have we gotten the engineering now and know how to do this really in a sophisticated way, the introduction of private enterprise and competition will allow for even greater innovation and a lowering of costs. Because you're going to see in the next few years privately designed and privately built unmanned probes to the moon and Mars and Venus. And those probes will be privately designed and owned and built, and therefore products they can sell to scientists, universities, as well as to other commercial sectors to make money. And that's coming. That's coming down the road.
This is the Bartholomew Town Podcast.
Interested in becoming a sponsor for the 2021 season of Bartholomew Town? Send me an email, bill@ripodcast.com. We've got some new packages coming, opening up the platform for potentially you out there. We'll talk soon.
At HealthSource RI for Employers, we provide access to health insurance to more than 1,100 local businesses and nonprofits, and 96% of them renew through us every year. Maybe it's our choice of 19 different health plans, our 10 years of customizing solutions, or our one local team of dedicated experts helping employers find quality health insurance. See how our numbers stack up for you. Learn more at healthsourceri.com/employers.